Hi, everyone. Welcome. And welcome to our education research series. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people, and that you can use in your shelter and your work supporting animals. Today, I'm excited to announce that our guest is Dr. Bill Nugent, a professor at the College of Social Work at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where he has been for over 30 years. He is former director of the PhD program and former associate dean of research. His areas of specialization include measurement and quantitative methods. He has also been conducting research on the links between violent political rhetoric and violence, including mass shootings and police shootings of civilians. He and his wife ran a Great Dane rescue for a number of years. And fun fact about Dr. Nugent, he is one of a few professors with a background as a catcher in a flying trapeze act. How exciting. Today, Dr. Nugent will be talking about his research on the Family Bondedness Scale when measuring equivalence between cat and dog owners. Let's welcome Dr. Nugent to learn more. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to my talk. Hope I can go through this without my voice disappearing, as I've been fighting off a bit of a upper respiratory thing. One of the first things I want to say is I want to thank the Program for Pet Health Equity at the University of Tennessee College of Social Work, as well as Maddie's Fund and PetSmart Charities for supporting the research that we've been doing. I want to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First thing is why we created this scale. Talk about theoretical underpinnings for the scale, the definition of what family bondedness is, and we'll talk briefly about the scale itself, go over some research results, as well as some practical uses for the scale. By the way, this is a picture of one of our guys. His name's Bliss. He's showing off how he's learned to climb a cat tree and take a nap in part of the cat tree. So there's a number of surveys been done recently, both national and international. And what they found is that, among other things, between 50 and 90 some percent of respondents say that they feel like their pet is as much a part of the family as any other human family member. The intensity of pet owners' feelings towards their pet family members has been underscored by research that indicates that the grief associated with the death of a pet is comparable to that with the death of a human family member. So anybody who's thinking about families now in any professional field, I think it'd be really important to be including their pets as a part of the family. There are a number of measures that have been developed, measure human-animal bond. Probably the most commonly used one is the Lexington Attachment to Pets Scale, or the LAPS. There's been a lot of research done on these various scales, but there's no scale right now or prior to our work that measured family bondedness. We think of family bondedness as the degree to which a pet is felt to be a member of the family in the same manner as a human family member. The conceptual basis for our scale is really a sociological theory termed the sociology of personal life and its perspective of the family. As opposed to being a structural theory of family, this framing is really more of an interactionist model. And in this model, persons can have close family-like relationships that provide them all sorts of emotional support without being thought of as part of a traditional family. So in this view, a person can be emotionally bonded with and view and feel that pets, friends, or even people who have passed on are as much a part of their family as other human family members. So we decided to build a scale to measure this concept. When we first started talking about it, creating it, the goal was to create a scale that would allow us to categorize families as either bonded or not bonded. But as we thought about the challenges associated with that, we changed the goal to create a scale that would allow us to measure the degree to which family members felt that their pet was as much a part of their family as any other human family member, and measure in a sense of more of like a almost like a scale, like a temperature scale, so it can measure greater degree or a lesser degree of that concept. Here's the definition of family bondedness that we used. It's defined as a state in which a person feels a positive valence emotional bond to a pet in a manner equivalent with their positive valence emotional bond to a human family member. Scales was called a Likert type scale. Many of you may have seen scales like this before. There'll be an introduction. There'll be a scaling option like I'll talk about here in a moment, and then a series of questions that you will answer by putting the number in a space or next to an item. In our scale, there were 5 response options, ranged from strongly disagree to strongly agree. There's 23 items on the scale. Scores can range from 23 to 115. And the higher the score, the greater the magnitude a person feels bonded to their pet in a manner equivalent with their attachment to another human family member. And vice versa, the lower, the opposite. There are no cut scores. Established cut scores are scores that once you reach that point, it enables you to be able to classify people as being in a particular category. We don't have any of those. Excuse me. We also don't have any population norms established. Population norms would be like what the typical mean score would be, and so on. We haven't reached that point yet. Excuse my coughing here. Here are items on the scale. One of the unique characteristics of the scale that we've developed is the pet's name goes in the item. And our rationale for putting pet's name in the item is that there's evidence by doing that, it will elicit to a greater degree the emotional bond that a person would have with their companion animal, to a greater degree than if it just said something like, I would feel lost without my pet. So for example, items will be something like, I love Tigger, assuming the dog's name is Tigger. I feel Tigger is a part of my family. I feel Tigger is like a child of mine. Here's some of the other items. I love to pet Tigger. Tigger comforts me when I have bad feelings. I feel Tigger loves me, and so on. So research we've done to date, there are 3 studies that have been published, one of which was just published today. I just got the notification that's in print now. All of these are on open access journals, so you should be able to access them. Here's the information on the different studies on the screen right now. The first one there, we did a measurement equivalence study, looking at the extent to which scores on the family bondedness scale would be equivalent or comparable between cat and dog owners. The second one, we looked at measurement equivalence of the equivalence of scores between black and white pet owners. And I'll talk a little bit more here momentarily about this whole idea of measurement equivalence. And then the last one was just published today. We created a Spanish version of this scale. And so then we did a study looking at the extent to which scores on the English and the Spanish versions were comparable. And that was just published online today. Here's some of the results that we found in our studies to date. First of all, in our study where we were looking at the measurement equivalence for cat and dog owners, the mean score in our sample of about 1,000 was almost the same for both groups. There was about almost a 3-point difference, with the mean score for dog owners being slightly higher, which some might interpret that to mean that the dog owners were slightly more bonded with their pets than what the cat owners were. But the difference is very small. In research, we talk about what are called effect sizes, which tells us how big and how important a difference is. And in this case, this difference was very, very small, and for all practical purposes was trivial. Reliability concerns how much measurement error there is in a set of scores. And so the scores from our measurement equivalent study comparing cat and dog owners, the reliability was 0.95 for cats, 0.96 for dogs. For those of you that aren't familiar with this concept, reliability is an index that ranges from 0 to 1, tells us how much random measurement error there's in a set of scores. The closer it gets to 0, the more error. closer it gets to 1, the less error. So you can see that the amount of error was very, very small in these scores. And in fact, the reliability coefficients for cat and dog owners were, for all practical purposes, the same. We did another study, of course, on looking at the measurement equivalence, comparing scores for the extent to which they were equivalent for black and white pet owners. Reliability coefficients there were 0.95 for the black pet owners and 0.96 for the white pet owners. Again, a trivial difference. And then finally, in the study we did, looking at the equivalence of Spanish scores on the Spanish version and the English version, the reliability was 0.97. So in all three cases, they were very, very much the same, high reliability coefficients, which suggesting relatively little amounts of random measurement error in those scores. We also did readability analyses. We looked at 10 different online readability calculators, and then we put the scale items into these calculators and calculated the mean. The mean flesh Kincaid grade level score is 3.4, indicating that the reading level required to go to read the scale and respond to it is somewhere between 3rd and 4th grade. There's a concept in measurements, first to is validity, which basically concerns the extent to which the scores that we're looking at measure what we think they're measuring. And one of the ways that that's established is by looking at comparing scores between two different versions of the same scale. And we look at that through what's called a correlation coefficient. The closer that correlation is to 1, the more they're measuring exactly the same thing. The lower, the less so. Correlation between the Family Bondedness Scale and the Lexington Attachment to Pet Scale was about 0.6 in a study that that's yet to be published. Doesn't surprise me that there's a bit of a difference, since I had a doctoral student a number of years ago do a study on the LAPS, and she found her findings suggested that there were problems with that scale. And I think it measures something similar to, but a bit different from what the Family Bondedness Scale measures. Still, a 0.6 validity coefficient is not bad. Now, let me talk about measurement equivalence. This is an important concept in measurement. Conceptually, it concerns the extent to which measures work the same for different populations. Another way to think of it is if we had a score on the Family Bondedness Scale of 84 from a cat owner and a dog owner, would those scores be indicating the exact same level of this concept of family bondedness? And so there's three critical forms of measurement equivalence. They're called configural, metric, and scalar. And so if you will forgive me for dipping a little bit into here, into some technical stuff, I've got a diagram here that I'm going to walk through to help understand this important notion of measurement equivalence. We've got a picture here of an oval, and in there it's labeled the latent concept. A latent concept is an idea or a notion that researchers use to represent a concept or construct that can't be seen. It's latent. So, for example, we don't talk about depression in a way we can put it on a scale and measure it, like weigh it or put it in a chair and talk to it. It's an unobservable variable. But there are indicators of something like depression, just like there are indicators of family bondedness. So this picture here, you can see my cursor moving. We've got the latent construct. We've got items like on a 3-item scale. And these single-headed arrows indicate that as this latent concept changes, scores on the items change. There are letters and numbers by each of these lines. These represent what are called factor loadings. They actually tell us how much the item score changes per unit increase in the latent concept. And so we have a factor loading for item 1 in population A, factor loading for item 2 in population A, and similarly here for item 3. We've got the same thing over here for the 3 items in population B. So something called metric invariance, which is an important part of, or important form of measurement equivalence, would say that the factor loading here for item 1 in population A is identical to the factor loading for item 1 population B. Similarly, the factor loading for item 2 in population A is going to be identical to the factor loading for item 2 in population B, and so on. So if all items have this kind of equivalence between the two populations, we say metric invariance exists. And why that's important is that tells us that as this concept increases here, of course, over here, that the item scores are changing in a way that faithfully represents the differences between two populations. It's also something called scalar invariance. Scalar invariance concerns what are called item intercepts. Items intercepts you can think of as the 0 points on these items. And so the intercept for item 1 in population A would tell us what the expected score on the item is if the latent concept is 0. And so we're going to have item intercepts for each of the items in population A for the scale. And similarly, we're going to have item intercepts for each of the items, but for population B. Scalar invariance would mean that the item intercept for item 1 in population A is identical to the item intercept for item 1 in population B. Item intercept for item 2 is going to be identical to the item intercept for item 2 in both populations, and so on. And if this is true for all the items and all the item intercepts, then we're going to have what's called scalar invariance. Configural invariance means that the same items, all the items load on the same concept. The load means that as this latent concept changes, scores on the items change. If you follow that, then if we have that combination of full configural, metric, and scalar invariance, what it tells us is that the scores on the scale itself will be the same for persons in both populations whose standing on the latent variable is the same. So basically, if you have people in both populations who have equal values on the latent construct, their observed scores on the scale itself will be exactly the same. So that means they're directly comparable. It's a very important concept. If you don't have these three forms of invariance or measurement and equivalence, then you can't really compare scores between different groups of people, because any differences you observe could in fact be due to artifacts of the fact that the measures don't work the same. So it's a very important concept, very important idea. And it's one of the reasons that we focus so much on getting evidence for equivalence of these scores across different groups of people. So what have we found? We found in terms of our measurement equivalence studies, their FBS scores show full configural, metric, and scalar invariance for cat and dog owners. FBS scores show full configural, metric, and scalar invariance for black and white pet owners. When we compared the scores on the Spanish and the English versions, we found full configural and metric invariance, but only partial scalar invariance. That means that some of the intercepts were not the same in the two populations for the different items. Fortunately, the practical significance of that was pretty minor. We actually did a study, an analysis, if you will, to see how much of a difference there was between expected scores on the scale for people who have the same level of latent construct, and the difference was less than 1 scale unit. So it was basically a practically non-significant difference. So we're to the point where we can talk about some of the possible uses of this scale. Veterinary social workers, I think, could find it very useful. For example, veterinary social workers do grief therapy. They do grief work with family members who have lost pets. Grief is likely to be greater the more bonded an owner is. Excuse me. And so the scale could be used by veterinary social workers, identifying people, family members who have a greater degree of family bondedness with the pet. And so grief therapy might actually need to be structured somewhat differently. Now, this isn't an area I'm knowledgeable about, but I'm speculating about this. Euthanasia counseling for veterinarians and veterinary social workers. As a veterinary social worker and a vet together perhaps start helping a family, preparing a family for the euthanasia of their pet. Knowing the degree of family bondedness could help them in terms of structuring how this would be done and the aftermath. So I think there's potential use there as well. Also assisting, I think scores on this scale could assist veterinary social workers in cases in many different ways. Could also be used by veterinarians, for example, here, just with the preparation for euthanasia. Psychiatrists, family therapists, clinical social workers could also make use of this in family assessments. Remember, I mentioned earlier that I think now the definition of family really should include pets as well. And so when you're assessing the family, this scale could be very useful for that. With multiple family members, the recommended way I would think to use a scale would be to have each family member complete the scale and then average the scores, and that average could be the measure of family bondedness for the family. Scores on this scale could also help clarify the role that pets play in a family. Family therapists might find that extremely useful. Finally, I think physical and occupational therapists might find it useful. They could use the scale to identify patients or clients who are highly bonded to pets in their family. So what they might do then is bring that pet in for the physical therapy or occupational therapy work and have that pet there. It may very well facilitate that kind of work. By the way, I want to point out this little dog here that's to the left of my writing. That's Riley, one of our guys. He woke up one morning and had bedhead, and so we thought that would be a great picture. So there's Riley with bedhead. Finally, here are references. I think you all are going to have access to my PowerPoint, and so you'll see a list of articles here, as well as the articles that I've cited in my PowerPoint here. And that's the point where we've reached our questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nugent. I'm glad that your voice was able to hold out through this presentation. But we're about to get to everyone's questions. Please enter them into the Q&A box. But before we do that, I'd like to welcome a special guest, and that is Dr. Azalea Boyd, who is the Chief Veterinary Medical Officer with CARE, who's going to be talking about a new offering from CARE that's going to be available called the Vet Ready course. Welcome, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having me on as a semi-guest today. And thank you, Dr. Nugent, for that presentation. So I love the presentation. I love the findings of the study. But from the veterinary side of things, so like Sheila introduced, I'm Dr. Azalea Boyd, so I'm a veterinarian. I'm the Chief Veterinary Medical Officer for an organization named CARE that you guys may be familiar with, Companion and Animals for Reform and Equity. And what we have done is, in the veterinary world, sometimes you hear certain comments that don't necessarily go along with the findings in this presentation, which is things like Black people don't like pets, right? Or Hispanic pet owners don't want to neuter their pets, which sometimes to some veterinarians, which we know veterinary medicine is a highly Caucasian American profession, so it's 98% white, that looks to veterinarians as other cultures don't care for their pets. And so what we aim to do with our certification program is provide comprehensive training to veterinarians and veterinary paraprofessionals to foster more of an inclusive and equitable environment within the field, as well as understanding key factors to help build trust between the client and the medical team. So that is a little bit about our Vet Ready certification program. Just really, giving the veterinary world understanding that not all patients are the same and not all people are the same. And there are a diverse backgrounds, cultural backgrounds of individuals that shapes how they care for their pets in various ways. A lot of times as veterinarians, we recommend very expensive gold standard and don't give gold standard treatment options and give nothing outside of these gold standard treatment options, because that's what we're taught in veterinary school. But Vet Ready, the certification program, encourages vets to seek a broader, accessible options for caring for their pets while maintaining respect for pet parents and their ability to apply care. So if you guys need more information, I don't know if I went into it enough or if you guys need more, but I'm happy to share, and also happy to share the stage for questions with Dr. Nugent.
If I could just make a quick comment. As a part of our analysis, we compared mean scores both at the latent trait level, the latent construct level, and the observed FBS score level. With the mean scores for black pet owners and white pet owners, as well as pet owners who indicated they came from a Latinx background heritage, and we found no differences in terms of mean bondedness scores.
Correct.
Dr. Boyd, thank you for sharing. We do have one comment in chat that a little bit more information about the course would be helpful.
The certification program will be launched Q1. So the beginning, January, February is kind of our timeline right now, but I will put the website in the chat where you guys can keep an eye on it. And then if you have more specific questions, I'll be happy to answer those. One of the questions that we typically get are, who is the course for? And the course essentially is for veterinarians and veterinary paraprofessionals. So that includes veterinary technicians, support staff, anyone who's committed to advancing racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in their respective roles. So ideal participants are those where communities are seeking either low-cost care, clinics, shelters, mobile practices, veterinary schools with predominantly white students, and or vet practices in predominantly marginalized or diverse communities. But I will definitely add that info in the chat.
Thank you. Our next question is, does euthanasia counseling exist for euthanasia technicians? And I'm assuming this is about euthanasia technicians in animal shelters.
If that question's to me, I don't know the answer to that.
I can help answer that question, Dr. Nugent. Euthanasia training does exist. It usually does not exist in the clinics per se, but there are outside companies that offer like bereavement training and euthanasia training. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's in social work, the profession I'm in, there's a new discipline called veterinary social work that I encourage everybody to investigate. Dr. Elizabeth Strand, she's got a joint appointment between the College of Social Work and the Veterinary College at UT. She's the one who actually created this discipline, and it's a growing discipline. And certainly, she trains veterinarians as veterinary social workers to plan how that process would occur and how to do grief therapy associated with it.
Thank you. You mentioned when you were talking about the correlation between the Lexington attachment to pet scale and the family bondedness scale was 0.6. And you felt that the two different scales were measuring something similar, but a little different. Can you
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about what you think's going on there?
Yeah, well, if you look at the items, for example, on the LAPS, you'll see items on there, for example, that don't really pertain to the bond so much, but really more like, for example, there's some interesting items on there about whether they agreed or disagreed with animal rights types of questions. So the items on the two scales are similar in some respects, but there are also substantial differences. And when you see differences between items like that, it's telling you that the scales don't have the same level of what we would refer to as content validity, meaning that the items, while they represent to some degree similar concepts, but also quite different ones. So the LAPS, it's been studied quite a bit. Tracy Zaparanek, one of our doctoral students who graduated a number of years ago, she did a dissertation on this. Anybody who's interested in it, you'll probably find it on site at at the UT Library.
Thank you. I know the LAPS is a little bit older as well. It was developed a while ago, and I know there's some items on there that I wonder whether accurately represent attachments. One of them is, does your pet sleep on your bed? And some people are very attached to their animals, but they prefer that their animals not sleep on their bed. So I wonder if that's a difference between the two scales as well.
Yes, that's an example.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and there's some cultural differences between groups of people too they could still be equally attached to their pet, but they would just not be on the bed or sitting next to them on the couch or something. Would have nothing to do with a bond, but really a difference just in different cultures.
A great comment, Dr. Nugent. We term something called the ideal pet parenting ideology. And the ideal pet parenting ideology is not, was made up by a certain section of people, right? So things like, I'm feeding my dog the food that I'm eating, or my dog has to stay inside the house with me even, or like you said, sleeping in the same bed. And if we don't all subscribe to the same pet parenting standards, then that could be looked at as not having that same level of bondness, which isn't accurate.
Yeah, and in our research, one of the variables we had in our analyses is what we call a control variable, was the number of hours that a pet was inside versus outside. And we found no relationship between that particular uh, question in our demographic questionnaire and how they scored on the FBS scale.
And I feel this topic is a really interesting one in terms of cultural differences as it relates to animal shelters, because as we do a better job of life saving with animals and are able to save more and more, there are definitely some dogs and some cats out there who prefer to live outside. They don't necessarily want to live in a home with people. And as some shelters are learning this, there's been a lot of discussion is it okay to do this? And I think so. The discussion is really interesting from a cultural standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the animals themselves and what they want and need, and what we assume that they want and need, which might not necessarily be true.
Yeah, and if as we've talked to other people, other researchers about what we've done, a very important point's been made that a very important perspective is left out with the measure that we use, which is the dog or cat or pet's perspective. And I think that's an area for future development of this kind of measurement technology.
Yeah, that would certainly be really exciting to see. Our next question is also about future things, and that is from Aviva, who's asking, is there an opportunity for future collaboration to retest or replicate the measure?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Anybody out there who's a researcher who's listening to this who would be interested in collaborating in any type of research with this scale, absolutely. Just get in touch with me. We have some other studies that are ongoing right now. For example, we've got some data from Meals on Wheels, and they administered our scale along with the LAPS, but not on a computer where people responded to the items. Instead, it was a telephone survey. So we're going to be looking at how this scale works in the context of a telephone survey. But also, there's some very interesting data there looking at something that I find really fascinating, which is a lot of people people who are not as well off as others at times of need, they will go without food or other needs in order to take care of their pets. And so we were interested in what variables are related to that and whether or not the degree of family bondedness was related to that. And I've got a doctoral student now who's actually doing an analysis of these data. So we'll be writing that up in the not too distant future.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Nugent. There is one more question from Danielle. Actually, we're getting a couple more coming in. Thank you. The next one is, were there items where responses did indicate a difference in bondedness You said that time spent outdoors, there wasn't a difference. Were there any where there was a difference?
Yes, we found some differences with respect to where people lived, whether they were suburban, urban, or rural. What our finding was is that people who were urban and suburban had about the same level of bondedness. People who were more rural, a little bit less so. That was a statistically significant difference. Again, it wasn't a huge difference, but still, we had a large enough sample size that that difference was significant.
Thank you. Our next question is,
what Meals on Wheels areas participated in the research and was age tracked?
Yes, age was included, and age was one of the variables in our analyses. I'm not quite sure what the questioner is asking with respect to area. As far as I know, it's just the National Meals on Wheels group.
Dr. Boyd, we had a question for you earlier in the chat. Just didn't know if you wanted to expand on it at all. The question was about whether you're using a trauma-informed care approach to the Vet Ready course.
Yep, I did see that question. I just put a brief comment, but yes, trauma-informed care, it's definitely a topic that we use. Actually, we're training individuals on even what trauma-informed care is, because a lot of people don't understand, especially veterinarians, that they are their clients are walking into a room, right, with their pet either being sick, or even if their pet is healthy, but they're coming with trauma from experiences, right, especially those in marginalized communities. And how can we better understand people and communicate and respond to challenging situations when we're dealing with clients that have multiple levels of trauma, as well as the veterinarians and veterinary staff themselves also coming with trauma. So, on both ends, how do we as veterinarians make sure that we are sensitive and approach clients and their situations with respect, and then also how do we protect ourselves as well? So it is a whole section on trauma-informed care.
You might want to contact, we have a certificate program here in the college in trauma-informed care. You might want to contact Dr. Reagan Shriver, as well as Dr. Elizabeth Strand with the veterinary social work program. Might be interesting to share notes on the trauma-informed information that you're using.
I do have some contacts from like the Vancouver Humane Society, but I love additional networking and contacts. So if you can share that, that would be great.
Oh, you're absolutely Dr. Reagan Shriver in the College of Social Work. And then Dr. Elizabeth Strand, she's in the college as well as she also works with the UT Vet Hospital, Veterinary College.
Sounds good.
Thank you. We have a little bit more clarification about Meals on Wheels. With Meals on Wheels, each senior nutrition program is provided by local groups. So urban versus rural areas are factors, access to assistance, natural supports, etc. I am wondering which local organizations helped out with this and the time frame in which it was done.
I'm not going to be able to answer a lot of that question. What I could tell you is that the survey was a couple years ago, but I'm not sure what all groups and organizations were involved.
Okay, thank you very much. We have an off-topic question for you, Dr. Nugent. Is there any progress being done to lengthen the lives of Great Danes? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, boy, I wish. I know they don't live long. Depends on what numbers you look at, but usually the Danes we lost. So we had Danes for many years. My wife and I, and wolfhounds. We had wolfhounds and Danes both. They were wonderful dogs. Typically, they're dying anywhere between 6 and 9. I think the most interesting thing I'm aware of is I believe there's some research being done on a vaccine for osteosarcoma. I don't know how far along that is, but that would be absolutely an enormous advance, because we lost Danes and wolfhounds both to osteosarcoma, terrible disease. I don't know anything more about that, but I do know there's There's research being done on that vaccine. I have no idea how far along that is, whether they're in clinical trials yet or not, but that would be a huge advance.
And in addition, I saw in the news recently, there's a company based out of San Francisco whose focus is longevity in dogs. And the company is called Loyal, Loyal, and they are doing trials right now, I believe, with a medication that can potentially extend the life of large breed dogs. I'm going to put a link to the article in chat. It sounds like some super interesting research that we should all keep an eye on
absolutely.
as time goes on.
Yeah.
I've heard of that too. We're definitely not using it in veterinary medicine right now, but there is this experimental drug, and Sheila, that Loyal's experimental drug, and it's designed to be an injection that you give every 3 to 6 months that is supposed to help prolong the life of your large breed dog. But I don't know very much about it. It's definitely not something that we've used, nor is it FDA approved by any means. So
thank you. Yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on. It's very, very interesting. Well, I think that is it for our questions. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Boyd, and thank you so much for Dr. Nugent for all the work that you're doing and for sharing your expertise and experience with us today. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Dr. Nugent will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion. Feel free to post more questions there. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time.